They say mountains don't move, but anyone who's worked in structural engineering long enough knows that's only half true. Slopes shift, water eats through rock, clay expands contracts and buckles. I spent 37 years designing foundations, bridges, hillside, stabilizations, you name it. So when I bought the property on the ridge in what Marlow Heights, I didn't look at the view. First, I looked at the soil from the back porch of my small cedar house. The drop behind me curved downward in a steep exposed slope about 35 ft, from the base of my retaining wall to the lowest point of the canyon. It was beautiful in the way wild things are beautiful, raw, rugged, and risky. There was a reason the property was under market value when I bought it. After retiring, no one wanted to deal with erosion control or high risk landslide zones, but I didn't flinch. I saw it as a puzzle I knew how to solve. The house sat on bedrock, but the slope behind it was mostly filled dirt, loose and prone to runoff. The first week after closing, I started design plans for a retaining structure, something unobtrusive but solid. I didn't want to alter the landscape. I wanted to reinforce it. I ran soil compaction tests myself, brought in concrete filled gabion baskets, and layered them with geogrid fabric. The whole thing ran 38 ft long and stood 10 ft tall. I finished in 3 months, did all the permitting, stamped the blueprints with my license, and filed everything with the county. By the time I was done, the wall wasn't just a feature, it was peace of mind. I planted creeping rosemary and native grass across the tiers, installed a weep drain system to relieve hydrostatic pressure and reinforced the top with a French drain that fed runoff into a controlled swale. I knew every inch of that system. I trusted it. The slope stayed still through 5 years of winter. Rains, flash floods, even a minor quake, not a single stone slipped until the HOA got involved. At first they didn't say much. I was grandfathered into the HOA, meaning I wasn't originally under their jurisdiction when I bought, but the neighborhood association had since expanded and now claimed oversight. I'd get the usual flyers about paint color suggestions and mailbox height standards, but no one bothered me. I paid a small annual fee, mostly to keep the peace, and stayed out of their way. That all changed when Marcy Weller became HOA president. Marcy was what we called a community visionary. She had no background in engineering or landscaping, but she loved the phrase aesthetically harmonious, and she wielded it like a weapon. At one of the community barbecues, she wandered up behind my house, wine in hand, and stood at the fence line. "Oh wow," she said, "that's sturdy, it's secure," I replied, half smiling. "Did you build it yourself?" "I designed it, oversaw the build." She nodded slowly like she was trying to admire it but couldn't quite get there. "You know, we're starting to push for a more unified look. Natural gradients, native lines. This feels a little prison wall, Ash." I didn't respond. I'd had engineers insult my work before, mostly in meetings, mostly men. But this was something else. It was that suburban urge to sand down every edge until the world looked like a model home. Weeks later, I got the first notice: violation of HOA aesthetic compliance, unauthorized structure detected. I almost laughed. The structure wasn't unauthorized. It was on record with the county, approved and signed off. But that didn't matter to the HOA. What mattered was it didn't match their new landscaping theme. Returning to nature, I sent back documentation photos, engineering specs, permit copies, slope safety assessments. I even invited the HOA's compliance committee to walk the site and inspect the drainage systems. None of them showed. Instead, I received a second notice, then a fine. By the time the third warning came, this time threatening forced removal if I didn't comply, within 60 days, I knew I was up against something worse than ignorance. I was up against ego. I requested a formal meeting. When I walked into the HOA clubhouse that night, the place was full. Residents, mostly older retirees, sat in neat rows. Marcy stood at the front in her blazer and pearls, flipping through a slideshow of unsightly modifications harming property values. Slide 4 was a close-up of my retaining wall. "Mr. Renner," she said, We respect your background, but the board has voted unanimously. The wall violates our harmony clause. It's an eyesore, it's aggressive in design, and it's not part of the original landscaping plan for the ridge. I stood up steady but firm. That wall is holding up 600 tons of unstable filled dirt. You can call it ugly, but it's keeping your homes from sliding into the canyon. Someone in the back chuckled nervously. I'll say it again, I continued. That slope is highly active. I have 12 years of seismic and rainfall data and a licensed analysis on record. You pull that wall down and you're rolling the dice with property safety. Marcy didn't flinch. We'll take your concerns under advisement, but you have 60 days to comply. I walked out, calm on the outside but boiling underneath. I wasn't about to dismantle something that kept my land and theirs stable, but I also knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The letter that arrived 3 days later was written on crisp ivory card, stock with an embossed HOA seal. It looked more like a wedding invitation than a legal threat, which somehow made it more insulting. The header read, Notice of Architectural Noncompliance. Final warning. And in flowing legal ease, it restated their demand: remove the wall within 30 calendar days or face administrative action, including but not limited to daily fines, contractor interference, and legal escalation. At the bottom, in unnecessarily ornate calligraphy, was Marcy Weller's signature, President, Marlow Heights Homeowners Association. I let the letter sit on my kitchen counter for a full day before I touched it again, not because I was intimidated, God no, but because I was fighting the overwhelming urge to march it down to the HOA office and drop it straight into their decorative koi pond. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do. I documented. I scanned every notice. I photographed every angle of the wall, showing its structural integrity, the tiered layers of vegetation growing naturally through the geogrid, the weep holes functioning properly even after the last rain. I printed copies of the original soil analysis and the civil engineering approval from the county inspector. I even dug up a copy of a geological report from 10 years prior that highlighted this particular slope as a moderate to high-risk erosion zone. Without proper retention, then I filed a response. It wasn't angry, it was methodical. I cited the county's zoning exception that allowed engineered stabilization on private land in high-risk topography. I reminded them of the HOA's own charter clause that stated HOA rules could not override municipal permits or civil engineering safety ordinances, and I warned without threats, just facts, that removing the wall could expose the community to irreversible damage. I sent it certified mail. I sent it via email. I even dropped a hard copy off at the clubhouse in person and got the receptionist to initial the delivery. Then I waited. The next few weeks were quieter than I expected. No response, no meetings, no new notices. I began to think maybe, just maybe, the logic had gotten through, but I should have known better. One Saturday morning, just as I finished oiling the hinges on the back gate, I heard the grinding of an engine on the gravel road. A white utility truck pulled up out front, unmarked, except for a small magnetic logo on the driver's side door. Mountain View Solutions, Landscape and Excavation. 2 men hopped out, both wearing reflective vests and looking confused. You Rayner? The taller one asked. I am. We've got an order to begin removal work on a retaining wall along the south slope. I blinked. You've got what now? He pulled a wrinkled form from a clipboard. It was printed on HOA letterhead. I scanned it quickly. It wasn't signed by any county official. There was no engineering firm listed. Just a vague authorization to begin landscape beautification adjustments as approved by the HOA board. This is private property, I said, my voice steady but cold. That wall is a permitted structure. You so much as touch a stone and I'll have the sheriff up here before you hit your second shovel. The man hesitated. We were told this was pre-approved. We're just doing what we were paid for. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Let me give you a piece of advice. You don't want to be the name on the accident report when that slope gives way. You don't want to be the contractor listed in the lawsuit when someone's sunroom slides 20 ft downhill into a eucalyptus tree. So, turn your truck around, call whoever sent you, and tell them the owner said no. They left slowly, but they left. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next HOA board meeting was pure theater. Marcy stood at the front, like a courtroom judge, reading from a prepared statement about resident noncompliance, and the board's right to enforce beautification measures to uphold neighborhood standards. I stood when she finished and walked to the front facing the room. You're not listening, I said. This isn't about beautification. This isn't about it. I swore this is about engineering. That wall is the only thing keeping your properties from landslide damage. I warned you. I gave you the data. If you ignore this and take it down, you will be responsible for what comes next. An older man in the front row, Mr. Ellerby, shifted uncomfortably. I don't want a landslide. I've lived here 22 years. Then you should be demanding the wall stays, I said plainly. Because if it goes, the water runs down the soil, follows it, and and so does everything else. It's not fear-mongering, it's physics. Marcy offered her trademark. Politicians smile. Thank you, Mr. Rayner. We appreciate your passion. They voted that night unanimous. I appealed to the city. They said it was a civil matter unless and until structural failure occurred. I called my attorney, who confirmed that while the HOA didn't technically have authority over permitted structures, they could push for court-ordered removal if they argued that the wall violated aesthetic guidelines in my deed covenant. A gray area, shady but not illegal. Weeks passed, and then one morning while I was at a dentist appointment, the crew came back. No warning, no signature from me. Just access through the side gate, broken later, and the beginning stages of demolition. They didn't even remove it properly. They knocked through sections of the wall like it was a decorative fence, destabilizing the upper layers without reinforcing the base. When I got home and saw the torn mesh, the scattered stones, the uprooted rosemary, I thought I'd stepped into a war zone. I called the police. I filed trespass charges. I contacted the city inspector, who was out for the week. The HOA claimed the wall had begun to fail naturally, and they were helping mitigate risk. I knew then what would come next. The slope didn't scream. It didn't announce its fury. It waited. The first time I truly feared for the neighborhood was 2 days after they tore through my wall. I stood in the early morning light, coffee growing cold in my hand, and watched the way the dew clung unnaturally to the slanted earth behind my property. Without the gabion base and geogrid mesh holding it all together, the soil had begun to slump and faint. Almost imperceptible waves, like something under the surface was breathing. It was subtle, but I'd seen it before in Peru when we were building a hillside road through a former agricultural terrace. In California, where drought-cracked slopes held together by root systems began to slip after winter rains. The signs were all there: micro-movements, tension, cracks at the surface, shifts in vegetation. But this slope, this was worse. It had been tampered with. I called the city's Watt Department of Geotechnical Safety and left a message. Then I called the HOA directly. Marcy answered. Mr. Rayner, she said in that tone of forced cordiality, I prefer all communication be in writing from now on. You just compromised a Class C slope. I said, do you even understand what that means? There's no need to raise your voice. Do you even know what angle of repose is? Do you know what happens when you remove lateral earth pressure mitigation without replacing it? Silence. I'm not yelling. I continued, more cold than loud. I'm trying to save you from a negligence lawsuit or worse. Reinstate the wall or put in proper anchoring immediately. She let out a short breath. We've spoken to a landscaping consultant who said the natural grade would hold, and we believe the shift you're referencing is residual settling from your original construction. That's not settling, I snapped. It's sloughing. That slope is moving, and if it moves fast, you're not going to have time to blame me before someone's living room ends up in the ravine. But she wouldn't budge. If you're concerned, I recommend you contact your legal counsel. Then she hung up. So I did the only thing I could. I documented everything. Again, I placed bright orange surveyor flags at marked points across the slope. I logged the distance from each flag to my back porch, and I began taking daily measurements. Over the next 6 days, the movement became undeniable. An average shift of 1.7 in across the mid-slope and nearly 3 in near the base. I filed an urgent complaint with the county geologist's office and submitted a full report, photos, charts, weather conditions. I included timestamps and noted that rainfall had been increasing due to an early season storm pattern, forecasted to dump nearly 4 in over the next 2 weeks. And then I went to the neighbors. I started with Mr. Ellerbay. He lived 2 doors down, retired school teacher, kind eyes, always wore socks with sandals. I brought my notes, some diagrams, and a quiet tone. It's not just my house at risk, I told him. The slope extends behind your yard, too. If it lets go, it'll take the community park and at least 3 houses with it. His face palled, but they said it was just cosmetic. They're wrong. I went house to house after that, showed them pictures of what happened in Montecito when the mudslides hit after a fire, explained how water saturation and improper grading could cause a progressive failure. I wasn't trying to scare anyone, I was trying to be honest. Most people were polite, a few were nervous. Some shrugged and said they called their insurance. But one woman, Cynthia Hall, took me seriously. She was new to the neighborhood, a civil litigator by trade, and she took one look at the survey flags and said, "You're not blue effing, are you?" "No, ma'am," I said. "And if that slope goes, I'm not sure any of us get to say, 'I told you so.'" She nodded once, and the next morning she requested an emergency meeting with the HOA board. They denied her request. "We're not geologists," Marcy reportedly said, "and we've already paid for a landscaping consultation that confirmed the grade is stable." It didn't matter that the so-called consultant had no license or that they'd never actually walked the site. What mattered was Marcy's pride, but the ground didn't care about pride. On the 8th day, the first crack opened. It started as a hairline fracture in the soil, running perpendicular to the slope like a scar. I saw it at dawn just before the sun fully rose, and I knew we were past the point of warning. I sent another report to the county. This time, they responded. A junior geotechnical analyst named Daniel Leung called me the next day, young, respectful, and utterly horrified as I walked him through the property. "I don't understand," he said. Crouching near the exposed seam, "They just took it down. They said it didn't match their landscaping vision." Daniel shook his head. "Sir, this isn't a landscaping issue. This is a slope stability emergency." He radioed his supervisor. Within 48 hours, the county placed an official slope watch on the ridge. Notices were taped to every HOA mailbox, and a temporary advisory recommended that homes within the impact zone minimize back porch use and monitor for signs of foundational movement. Marcy, in her next mass email, downplayed the warning, just a routine inspection. She wrote, "No cause for alarm." But the residents were no longer convinced. You could feel the unease ripple through the streets. People started knocking on my door at night, asking about sandbags, asking if they should evacuate, asking what I would do. I told them the truth. If the rain hits hard enough and the ground's already shifting like this, I'd sleep with my shoes by the bed. By the end of that week, half the neighborhood was whispering about the HOA's arrogance. I overheard someone call Marcy Queen Mudslide. Another neighbor started digging small trenches to direct water away from his foundation. But it wouldn't be enough because the clouds were gathering and the earth was holding its breath. It started with the roar of machinery, too early, too loud, too close. I was in my workshop sanding the edge of an old pine beam. When I heard it, the metallic grind of gears, the distinct clatter of a hydraulic bucket, and then the sudden hiss of compressed air from a jackhammer biting into earth. My stomach sank. I dropped the tool and stepped outside, across the ravine on the slope where my wall used to be. 2 men in neon vests were back, but these weren't the cautious landscapers from weeks before. These men were reckless. One was operating a small bobcat loader, its wheels caked in fresh mud, while the other shoved flag stakes into the ground with no regard for topography or water. Runoff, piles of dislodged soil slumped in uneven mounds near the base. There were no erosion nets, no silt fences, no signs of proper shoring or grading techniques, just brute force and no one from the county was supervising. I crossed the property line without a word, pulled out my phone and started filming. The loader operator didn't even look up. He scraped another chunk of slope free this time, dangerously close to the cedar retaining beam I'd installed years ago as a secondary anchor for my foundation runoff. Soil gave way beneath the blade and slid several feet before stopping against a boulder. "Hey," I shouted, "who's in charge here?" The man with the stakes glanced over, blinking like I'd interrupted a daydream. "Y'all have a permit?" I asked. He hesitated. "We're under contract with the HOA." "Who's the foreman? Where's the work order? Where's the grading plan?" He shrugged, then went back to hammering in stakes. No hard hat, no soil engineer in sight. I turned around and walked straight to the HOA office. The community clubhouse was empty, except for Barbara, the soft-spoken treasurer, who always wore floral cardigans and a permanent look of mild panic. "They're doing it right now," I said. "Unlicensed crew, no permits, no soil mitigation. Do you understand what's about to happen?" Barbara blinked, then shuffled through a file drawer, clearly stalling. "I need Marcy," I said. "She's in a meeting at her home." "Not anymore." I drove the half-mile to her house and pounded on her door like I was waking the dead. It was nearly noon. When she opened it, she wore satin pajamas and an expression that turned from confusion to contempt the moment she saw me. "Mr. Rayner, this is highly inappropriate. You've got unlicensed excavation happening on a slope the county just flagged as unstable." She crossed her arms. "We're simply restoring the landscape to its natural. You're destabilizing the entire ridge. Do you even know the name of the company you hired?" She smirked. "I believe it's Alpine Environmental. They're not licensed in this county. Their business registration is expired. They're a handyman outfit from 2 towns over that rents heavy machinery from Home Depot." She stiffened slightly. "We vetted them." "No, you didn't," I said. "You just look for someone cheap." She stepped forward and lowered her voice. "You're blowing this out of proportion because you didn't get your way. The wall is gone. Move on. I don't want my house buried, Marcy, or yours or anyone's." She didn't answer. So I went home, pulled out the contact list I kept from my engineering days and started dialing. I called a retired inspector I used to work with in Santa Clarita. I called a grad student who was studying landslide simulation at the state university. I called a contact in the county surveyor's office and told him everything. And then I filed a formal complaint with the POD Department of Building and Safety, complete with timestamps, video evidence, photos, and the name of the crew they'd hired. I even emailed local news stations. One responded, "Sounds like a David versus Goliath story." The producer wrote, "If the slope fails, let us know." That night it rained. Not a downpour, just steady soaking rain enough to turn the loose soil into something dense and dangerous. At around 100 UAM, I was jolted awake by a low rumble. It sounded like thunder, but deeper, like it was inside the earth instead of the sky. I ran outside with a flashlight and aimed it toward the slope. A 6 FT section of the hill had slumped, not fully collapsed, but shifted violently enough to drag down a young pine tree and twist the irrigation piping Marcy had installed for native landscaping. Water pulled at the base in a wide arc, blocked only by the boulder from earlier. I filmed it all. The next morning, the HOA doubled down in a newsletter titled "Progress on the Ridge Beautification Project." Marcy wrote, "We're pleased to report that early grading has begun as planned. Residents may notice some temporary soil movement, which is a normal part of the regrading process." That same day, 2 more cracks appeared. One in the backyard of Mr. Ellerby's home, the other in the community park's walking path. Someone taped yellow caution flags around the area, but nothing was roped off. By the end of the week, the Bobcat crew had vanished. I later learned from Barbara that they walked off the job after the driver nearly rolled the loader into a ravine when the ground gave way under one of the wheels. They said it wasn't safe. She whispered to me on the sidewalk, and they weren't insured, and yet nothing was fixed. No reinforcements, no call for professional stabilization. Marcy remained silent, so did the rest of the board. Residents started whispering. Rumors spread that the HOA had used discretionary beautification funds meant for tree trimming and seasonal lights to pay for the wall's removal. Others claimed the board had planned to risk zone part of the slope for a meditation garden and wanted the wall gone for aesthetic reasons. But speculation didn't matter. Gravity didn't care about gossip, and the worst was still ahead. It started with a pop. Subtle, distant, like the crack of a knuckle. I heard it while trimming the rose hedges at the edge of my property. And for a moment, I thought it was nothing more than the shifting of a branch or a bird landing too hard on the fence, but then it happened again, louder, followed by a deep, unmistakable groan from the earth itself. I dropped the shears and stepped back. The slope, once a seamless wave of earth and rosemary, now looked fractured like a sheet of glass just struck by a stone. Jagged lines ran horizontally across the middle tier where the wall used to brace the soil. I approached slowly, scanning for surface separation, and found it almost immediately. A one-inch crack cutting clean across the exposed dirt. I placed a wooden skewer into it and watched it disappear halfway. My hands went cold. I knew what this meant. Lateral shear, subsurface movement, the beginning of slope creep. That night I wrote a formal letter addressed to every homeowner on the ridge. I attached annotated photos, highlighted risk zones in red, and printed copies. Landslide readiness checklist I'd adapted from FEMA's guide. I sealed each one by hand and walked the entire block, sliding them into mailboxes and under doormats, even taping a few to glass doors when I had to. By morning, the neighborhood felt tense. People who had once avoided eye contact with me were now glancing in my direction with tight nods. Cynthia Hall cornered me as I returned from my walk. "They ignored your last 3 warnings," she said flatly. "I've been tracking it. Crack open last night," I told her. She clenched her jaw. "I spoke to my insurance agent this morning. They said HOA negligence isn't always covered, especially not when it's deliberate." She exhaled slowly. "I've started documenting too." By that afternoon, new cracks had appeared. One in the corner of the HOA's newly landscaped meditation path. So much for serenity, and another running through Mr. Ellerby's garden shed. He called me in a panic, his voice shaking as he held the phone to the creaking back wall of his workshop. "The floor's sloping," he said. I put a marble down. It rolled straight to the back corner. I told him to get out of the shed immediately and not to store anything heavy along that wall. More neighbors began noticing changes. Lawn ornaments tilted, patio furniture wouldn't sit level, sliding doors stuck slightly off track. Even the mailboxes, once standing in a straight HOA-approved row, now had a slight lean like spectators inching back from something too dangerous to watch but too compelling to turn away from. And still the board said nothing. That week's HOA newsletter included a bland update about progressive landscape settling and temporary cosmetic shifts. They offered no solutions, no plans for inspection, just reassurance that everything is under review. But you can't review what you refuse to acknowledge. I decided I'd had enough. I printed a 3FT wide banner that read, "This is what happens when engineers are ignored." I staked it in my backyard facing the slope. It drew attention. A few residents nodded quietly. Others whispered about it during their evening walks. Someone even took a photo and posted it anonymously to the neighborhood Facebook group. The post was titled, "Do you still trust the board?" It got 57 comments in 2 hours. Barbara, the HOA treasurer, showed up at my door that evening, visibly shaken. "Please," she said, "can we talk?" I invited her in. She sat at my kitchen table, staring into her tea like it held answers. I told Marcy we should pause. "The project," she said softly. "After the wall came down, after the contractor walked out, I told her it wasn't safe." "What did she say?" she said. "If we admitted fault, we'd be liable. She told me not to worry, that it would settle on its own." I leaned forward. "Barbara, listen to me. This is no longer about landscaping. If this slope fails, it could bury homes, kill someone. We're not in theoretical territory anymore. We're in countdown mode." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never wanted this." "Then help stop it." She nodded. The next morning she resigned. She posted a letter to the HOA portal stating that she could no longer in good conscience participate in decisions that endangered the community. She cited the ignored warnings, the unlicensed contractors, the falsified funding reports for the project. It was the first domino. 2 more board members resigned within 48 hours, but Marcy clung on. Stubborn, silent, she issued vague statement blaming internal disagreements and assured residents that the situation was under control. But by then the cracks weren't just in the slope, they were everywhere. Fractures in fences, gaps between patios and home foundations. One homeowner found a 6-inch depression forming under their garden steps. Another called the fire department when a section of their backyard collapsed into a hollow pocket, revealing fractured PVC pipes and water leakage. Cynthia began organizing legal fund. She printed flyers. She scheduled a town hall and she invited me to speak. I didn't want to. I'm not a performer, I'm an engineer, but when you know something bad is about to happen and people's lives hang in the balance, you don't wait for applause. The meeting was packed. Dozens of residents crammed into the local library's community room. I stood in front of a projected map, red lines marking the danger zones, and walked them through every stage of what had happened and what was likely still to come. I didn't shout. I didn't dramatize. I used facts, photos, measurements, rain forecasts, soil composition charts, and one devastating prediction. If the rain continues, I said, we're looking at a progressive slide, and if it's triggered all at once by weight, water, or vibration, there's a very real chance that this community loses not just land but homes. A silence fell across the room. Then Cynthia stepped forward. "We're filing for an emergency injunction against the HOA tomorrow. I want everyone who supports it to sign." Every pen in the room moved. Marcy didn't show her face that night, but nature did. The next morning, a new crack opened. This time, it went right through the main walking path and kept going. It began with a drizzle, light, hesitant, as if the sky itself was deciding whether to intervene. By mid-afternoon, the drizzle had thickened into rain, cold, persistent, and mean. The kind of rain that doesn't just soak the ground, it saturates. It turns it into something bloated and unstable. I stood on my porch, watching it hammer into the already distressed slope behind my home, and felt a weight settle deep in my gut. The rain wasn't going to stop, and neither was the slope. Around 4:30 p.m., I went down to the lower ridge and heck, the flags I'd planted weeks ago. 3 of them were gone, swallowed. The horizontal crack across the mid-slope had widened. You could now see dark earth beneath the surface, and a chunk of the topsoil had slumped, sloughing toward the bottom in a soft, viscous fold. I filmed it, time-stamped it, and uploaded it to a folder I'd already shared with the county. At 6:12 p.m. I received a message from Cynthia. "Water bubbling up in the park. Looks like a pipe broke." A few minutes later, another from Mr. Ellerby. "Ground feels soft behind the fence." Too soft. Then from Barbara, "2 neighbors are packing bags. They don't feel safe." I texted back. "They're right." By 7:45 p.m. the street drains were full. Water ran down the sidewalks in thin sheets, soaking into every inch of the hill. I could smell the loam, rich, wet, disturbed. It reminded me of excavation sites overseas, except this time no one was in control. I stayed up that night. At 9:06 p.m. the first trees started to lean, not fall, just lean, as if they were bending to listen to something rising beneath them. At 9:32, Cynthia called. "They're still not responding," she said, breathless. "The HOA," I called. "Marcy twice. Where is she?" "Home. I think her lights are on, but she won't answer." "What do we do?" "You do whatever you have to," I said. "If it lets go, you'll have seconds, maybe." It hit just after midnight, not a rumble, not a roar, a snap like a bone breaking. And then everything moved. I was at the window. When it happened, the center of the slope gave first, pulling the earth into a bowl that twisted and dragged everything downhill with it. A ribbon of mudroots, stones, and shrubs peeled away from the hillside like a rug ripped off the floor. The noise was unholy, like thunder and screams and trees breaking in half all at once. The old cedar tree at the park edge tipped like a drunkard and was gone in a blink. The walking path, concrete, carefully laid brick, solar lights folded inward as if swallowed by a giant mouth. And then the water line snapped. A geyser of muddy spray shot up like a fountain. And in the chaos of it all, I saw the retaining border that once held the HOA's prized meditation garden vanish beneath the torrent. My porch shuddered. The ground around my own house held but barely. I stepped outside with a flashlight, the beam cutting through sheets of rain and dust. The park below was gone, the field flattened, benches splintered, fence posts protruding like broken ribs. 3 homes along the ridge had collapsed partially, one of them tilting sideways. Like a capsized ship, its foundation sheared off at the base, mud up to the windows, and at the center of it all the slope bled out in silence. I called 911. I wasn't the only one. By 12:30 a.m., emergency crews were on site. Floodlights lit up the devastation, casting long shadows over jagged earth and fractured concrete. Firefighters secured perimeters. Paramedics rushed to the house nearest the collapsed zone. An elderly couple had been trapped when their porch caved. They made it out with bruises and one dislocated shoulder, but they were the lucky ones. At 1:02 a.m., someone found Marcy. She was standing in her backyard, barefoot, soaked, shivering, her mouth open but no sound coming out. Her prized rose trellis lay twisted beside her, its base snapped, roots exposed. When the deputy asked if she was all right, she finally spoke. "I told them it would be fine." Her voice cracked. Then she repeated again and again, "I told them it would be fine." The next morning the storm passed, but the neighborhood was changed. The county closed off the entire lower ridge. Geologists arrived within hours, drones scanning the terrain, mapping subsurface fractures. Surveyors posted uninhabitable signs on 3 houses. An emergency order went into effect banning any further HOA-funded construction without civil engineering oversight. And Marcy, she vanished, packed up her car and left before sunrise. No forwarding address, no public apology, no explanation. But the damage was done. The slope had collapsed, and with it so had the credibility of the HOA. Neighbors gathered in silence that morning, mud-covered shoes, dazed expressions. Mr. Ellerby wept openly when he saw what had become of the park. He used to walk his dog in every morning. Cynthia stood next to me at the ridge edge, arms crossed, eyes glassy. "They did this," she said. "No," replied. "They caused it, but nature," she just answered back. She turned to me. "What happens now?" I looked at the mess, the broken fences, the caved land, the twisted beams of homes that once stood tall, and I answered the only way I knew how. "We rebuilt, but this time with people who listen," and for the first time in weeks she smiled. It didn't take long for the narrative to shift. By the second morning after the landslide, as county officials continued their surveys and a few neighbors began the painstaking work of salvaging their properties, a whisper started to snake its way through the neighborhood like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Rainer's wall might have caused it. I first heard it from Barbara. She stopped by mid-morning holding a coffee cup she hadn't sipped from her hands, trembling ever so slightly. "They're saying," she began, voice tight, "they're saying your original retaining wall was defective, that it redirected groundwater, created pressure, and destabilized the slope." I blinked at her. "You mean the wall that held steady for 6 years without issue?" "The wall They tore down, she nodded helplessly, I told them, but Marcy's friend's there, planting the idea that the wall set this whole thing in motion. I leaned back against the porch beam and stared out toward the wreckage below. The slide scar was still raw, the soil darker where it had torn open. You could see the jagged path it carved through the earth, starting almost exactly where the wall had once stood. They're going to try to bury this, I muttered, the same way they buried the slope. Sure enough, that afternoon, a letter went out from what was left of the HOA board. 2 members, now both of whom had stood silently beside Marcy through every disastrous vote. The letter was dripping in carefully curated language, clearly crafted by a lawyer. Why should we acknowledge the recent geological event affecting several properties on the South Ridge? Preliminary assessments suggest multiple contributing factors, including historical alterations to the natural grade of the slope. At this time, we are investigating whether certain structural modifications, namely unauthorized retaining systems, may have initiated water redirection leading to failure. Unauthorized. They called my permitted county-approved wall unauthorized. The next paragraph chilled me further. Until a full assessment is complete, residents are advised to refrain from public commentary that may interfere with pending liability evaluations. Translation: shut up, don't talk, we're building our defense. I didn't stay quiet. I printed copies of every permit, every engineer-stamped drawing, every dated soil report from the time I built the wall. I walked them over to Cynthia's house, where the informal community legal team had gathered at her dining room table. They looked tired, but when I laid the folder down, their eyes sharpened. These are gold, Cynthia said, flipping through the pages. They show you followed the law, that you had it approved, that it was working until they destroyed it, she nodded, and that is the foundation of negligence. By the end of the day, she'd added the documents to our legal claim against the HOA. But still, the smear campaign grew. Neighbors eyed helped dig out of the mud were now hesitating when they saw me. One woman crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Mr. Ellerby, bless him, refused to believe it, but even he confessed that someone had left a typed flyer in his mailbox with bold red letters. Engineer's wall destabilized the ridge. No attribution, no name, just cowardice. The local news picked it up next, a brief report on the evening broadcast. Recent landslide in Marlow Heights has sparked controversy as allegations surfaced that a homeowner's private retaining wall may have played a role in the disaster. They showed a blurry photo of my backyard, my name in the caption, and a voice-over quoting HOA representatives who declined to speak on camera, but expressed concerns about unauthorized engineering. I turned off the TV. They wanted a scapegoat, and they chose the one person who had tried to stop this from the beginning. But I wasn't going to be quiet, and I sure as hell wasn't going to be blamed. The next morning, I called an old friend, Dr. Louis Bader, retired geotechnical professor from Cal Poly, now consulting independently. I'd worked with him on a hillside reinforcement project 20 years ago in Tanga Canyon. When I explained the situation, he asked one question: did you keep slope monitoring data? I smiled grimly. Daily logs, photos, flag movement measurements, rainfall indexes, all time-stamped. Then I'll be there tomorrow. When Derbader arrived, we walked the ridge together. He brought a LAR scanner, took readings, examined the soil compaction around the base of the collapse, and made quiet notes. After 2 hours, he turned to me. This wasn't caused by a wall, he said. It was caused by the absence of one. I exhaled. He filed his own report that night, a comprehensive, professionally notarized point-by-point breakdown of the collapse. It identified the critical failure zone as the area formerly supported by my retaining wall. It also pointed out clear evidence of poor regrading, surface erosion, and water mismanagement directly resulting from the HOA's contractor work. Cynthia included it in our legal filing the next day. Still, the HOA's tactics escalated. I received a cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation, an undue disruption of HOA governance. They threatened to sue me for creating division within the community. I laughed aloud reading it. They tore down my wall, caused a landslide, and now I'm the disruptive one, I said to Cynthia. Classic misdirection, she replied. Don't worry, we're filing our counterclaim this week. And we did. By week's end, our attorney filed suit against the HOA for gross negligence, unauthorized entry and destruction of private property, defamation, and public endangerment. We submitted Dr. Bader's report, my documentation, the county permits, and eyewitness accounts from neighbors who'd seen the crew tearing down the wall without proper safeguards. But perhaps most damning was the email leak. Barbara, quiet cardigan-clad Barbara, sent us a folder. Inside were scanned copies of HOA emails between Marcy and the other board members. One in particular stood out, dated just before the wall demolition began. Marcy had written, "Oh, we can't let Rainer's wall stand. If we do, everyone will think they can build whatever they want. It's a precedent thing. Even if he's right, it has to go, even if he's right." That line would haunt her because now the entire community knew I had been right, and they had ignored it on purpose. As our case gained traction, the mood began to shift again. Whispers of blame became murmurs of apology. One by one, neighbors began knocking, some with casseroles, some with tears, most with guilt etched into their faces. "I'm sorry," one woman said, voice cracking. "I should have spoken up." "You still can," I told her, "because this wasn't over." But the tide was turning, and for the first time since the earth gave way, it felt like justice might finally take root. By the time the depositions began, my kitchen table had become a war room. Stacks of printed diagrams lined the surface, cross-sections of the original slope, water flow models, before and after satellite images. I had charts that tracked rain accumulation over the past 6 years, and spreadsheets that listed every observed crack, depression, and shift in topography since the day they tore my wall down. Each document was labeled, time-stamped, and categorized with the kind of precision only a lifelong engineer or a man seeking justice could maintain. I had built bridges over ravines that shook in earthquakes and held firm. I had anchored structures in loose volcanic soil, and now I would anchor this case. Cynthia was the first to see the full spread. She stepped into my home, took one look at the living room covered in maps and folders, and let out a slow breath. "You were documenting before they even started digging?" I nodded. I knew where it was going. They didn't want safety. They wanted symmetry. She sat down and began flipping through the photos. "We're going to bury them with this." "No," I said, "I'm not trying to bury them. I'm trying to protect what's left." That week, our attorney scheduled a formal review with the county's Public Works Department. I presented my findings to a panel of inspectors, engineers, and risk analysts. I walked them through every phase, from the original soil analysis to the structural schematics of the Gabion system, to the sequence of events leading up to the collapse. Dr. Bader joined via teleconference, reiterating his conclusion that the wall had been essential to slope stability, and its removal was not only reckless but directly responsible for the collapse. When I was done, the head engineer for the county, a stout man named Morales, who rarely spoke during public meetings, cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Rainer, why weren't you on the HOA board?" That got a few quiet chuckles. I offered, I replied. They told me I was too technical. A week later, we presented our findings to the homeowners during a special emergency assembly. The library was packed again, standing room only, but this time there were no whispers, just silence. Heavy, expectant, shamaded silence. Cynthia opened the meeting. "We were lied to," she said, voice calm but stern. "We were manipulated, and now some of us are living in temporary housing while others face foundation repairs that could take months. We deserve answers. We deserve accountability. And thanks to Mr. Rainer, we have the proof." She gestured to me. I stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime preparing for moments just like this. I projected a 3D terrain model on the screen behind me. The audience watched as I toggled between layers, vegetation, soil, density, drainage. "This is the slope before the wall," I said. "This is after construction." I clicked again. "And this is what it looked like 48 hours before the slide." I zoomed in to show the seam where the soil had failed, highlighted the point of shear, cross-referenced it with the wall's former location. "You can see where the water pulled right here, and you can see where the contractor removed supporting rock without replacing it, without even installing temporary bracing." Several homeowners gasped. Then I showed them the email, the one Barbara had leaked. Ed, Marcy's damning sentence filled the screen in bold red font. "We can't let Rainer's wall stand. If we do, everyone will think they can build whatever they want. It's a precedent thing. Even if he's right, it has to go." No one spoke, not even a cough. I warned them, I said. Not bitter, not smug, just tired. I begged them. Not because I wanted to win, because I wanted us all to be safe. I stepped back. Cynthia returned to the podium. "We will be voting to remove the remaining board members immediately, and we are filing a collective civil action. If you wish to join the suit, please sign the form outside." They lined up. That night I sat on my porch with a blanket over my knees and watched the clouds roll by. The slope was still scarred, raw and torn like an open wound, but there was no more movement. The earth was quiet again. Barbara called later to say she'd heard the state was reviewing whether the HOA charter could be suspended pending litigation. "There's talk," she whispered, "of placing the neighborhood under county stewardship for 6 months. "Good," I said. "Maybe someone will finally listen." But the battle wasn't over. The HOA's legal team fired back within days. A thick envelope arrived at my door with a notice of intent to counter-sue, claiming my original construction had violated community harmony and lacked HOA approval. They tried to argue that aesthetic noncompliance somehow justified their demolition, and that the resulting damage was therefore not their fault. It was laughable but still dangerous. I passed the letter on to Cynthia. "They're grasping," she said. "Let them." We filed a motion to dismiss the counterclaim on grounds of bad faith. Within days, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing. Meanwhile, the local news returned. This time they wanted an interview, not with Marcy. She had disappeared entirely, but with me. The segment aired the following week. Retired engineer's wall was destroyed by his HOA. What happened next could change how associations across the county operate. They showed the footage I had taken of the slope moving. They quoted Dr. Bader. They aired my side finally. And then something incredible happened. Emails poured in from engineers, from city planners, from homeowners in other communities who had fought their own HOAs. One wrote, "Thank you for standing up. We all thought we were alone. Your proof we're not." Another said, "You saved lives even if they never say it." I didn't cry, but I did sit there for a long time that night, staring at the mountain that had both tested and vindicated me. They'd torn down my wall, but now I had something stronger: truth. When the county issued its first official statement, it read like an indictment. Following an independent engineering review, it is the opinion of this office that the structural failure of the south slope in Marlow Heights resulted directly from unauthorized and improper removal of a previously permitted retaining wall. The HOA did not consult with county engineers, nor did they secure the appropriate permits for earth-moving activity. This failure led to catastrophic slope destabilization, property loss, and endangerment of life. It was everything we'd waited for. The document was stamped, signed, and published publicly on the county's website within 24 hours of our last court motion. The timing was no coincidence. 2 days later, I received an invitation to a county commission hearing. It wasn't a court trial, not yet, but it was something nearly as powerful: a formal review of HOA governance within unincorporated communities, the kind of bureaucratic oversight most associations assumed would never be enforced. When I arrived at the meeting hall, the parking lot was full. Camera crews, reporters, community leaders, HOA presidents from other districts, some nervously checking their notes, others flat out sweating. Inside, A panel of 7 commissioners waited behind a long oak bench flanked by county attorneys and civil engineers. In front of them sat 2 tables. I was at one. At the other, the remaining members of the Marlow Heights HOA board. Barbara had already resigned. Marcy had vanished. That left Ron Keller, the vice president, who had never once spoken publicly during the crisis, and Lacey Kim, the secretary, whose greatest contribution to the HOA had been organizing a lavender mailbox ribbon campaign the year before. They didn't look at me. The commissioner in the center called the hearing to order. We are here today to determine whether the Marlow Heights Homeowners Association acted with gross negligence, failed to comply with county engineering codes, and endangered public safety. Mr. Renner, please begin. I stood slowly, brought my prepared documents, and took a deep breath. My name is Walter Renner. I'm a licensed structural engineer, retired, and I've lived in Marlow Heights for nearly a decade. I built a retaining wall on my property to secure a known unstable slope. I filed all permits. I followed every regula. I paused, then laid down the folder of printed emails. This board, led by President Marcy Weller, chose to remove that wall not for safety reasons, but because it didn't match their landscaping aesthetic. They ignored my warnings, rejected data, and hired an unlicensed contractor to perform earthworks without slope stabilization. I clicked a button. Behind me, a projector screen lit up with the timeline. Wall removed, April 4th. Minor cracks reported April 17th. Slope collapse May 3rd. I walked them through every stage, every flag marker, every neighbor's testimony. Then I dropped the hammer. We have a whistleblower email written by Marcy Weller stating clearly that even if I was right, the wall had to go. She acknowledged the risk. She acted anyway. There was silence after I finished. Then the commissioners began questioning the board. Ron Keller tried to deflect. We acted based on community consensus. He said there were multiple complaints about the visual impact of the wall. And did you seek an engineering assessment before demolition? A commissioner asked. We consulted a landscaping firm not licensed for structural evaluation. No, but, and who authorized the excavation? President Weller handled that. I was under the impression you were vice president. Did you ask for a permit? No, but I assumed. You assumed the commissioner said flatly, writing something down. Lacey Kim was no better. I was told it was just a beautification project, she said. I didn't know we were removing critical infrastructure. That was their defense. They didn't know. The county wasn't amused. By the end of the hearing, the commissioners issued 3 immediate actions. 1. A cease and desist order on all HOA construction activity until a full audit was completed. 2. Temporary oversight by the county's Office of Community Integrity to review all HOA communications and financial decisions for the past 18 months. 3. Referral to the district attorney's office for potential charges of criminal negligence and willful endangerment. The news broke that afternoon. The HOA had failed and now the county was stepping in. The mood in Marlow Heights shifted. Overnight, for weeks, our neighborhood had felt like a place fraying at the seam. Suspicion in every glance, tension in every sidewalk exchange. Now there was something else reckoning. People began coming forward. Barbara testified publicly, revealing how Marcy had silenced dissent within the board and funneled discretionary funds to fast-track the wall's removal. Mr. Ellerby wrote a guest column in the local paper titled, "We Were Warned and We Laughed." And one brave homeowner, Emily Tran, whose porch had nearly collapsed, organized a petition to formally dissolve the HOA and replace it with a residential council. It gathered over 100 signatures in 3 days, but there was more. The insurance companies began circling. At least 4 homeowners filed property damage claims against the HOA. But when the adjusters reviewed the cause, unauthorized slope disturbance, no permits, known risk, they denied coverage. You should sue your HOA. One adjuster reportedly told a stunned homeowner, they created this liability, not you. Class action discussions began. Cynthia and I sat down with a representative from a major law firm, one that specialized in HOA abuse. They had litigated against 3 associations in the past 2 years, all of them resulting in 6 or 7-figure judgments. They called our case one of the most clear-cut examples of gross negligence they'd ever seen. But the most vindicating moment came quietly. One morning I received an envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "I was wrong, you tried to protect us. I didn't listen. Thank you for not giving up." It wasn't signed, it didn't need to be. The fight wasn't over, the lawsuits would take months, maybe years. The land would need years to stabilize, and the scars might never fully heal, but something had changed. The lie had broken, the truth had stood, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I stood on my porch, looked out over the wounded hill, and felt something I hadn't in weeks: stillness. Not because the land was quiet, but because the noise had finally started to fade. The morning the county finished the final slope reinforcement plan, I stood at the edge of my property with my boots deep in the soft earth, watching as surveyors paced back and forth, spraying lines, setting stakes, and marking new contours. Old Scar was still visible, though slowly healing, covered now in erosion netting and lined with temporary BMS to hold back runoff. They'd be installing a new retaining system soon, not a flimsy one. This time it would be a county-funded civil engineer-approved structure with deep anchors and a drainage matrix designed for a 100-year storm event. Ironically, it looked a lot like the one I had built. Too industrial, Marcy had once said. Now it was considered best practice. See, I didn't smile at the irony. I just felt tired, but a good kind of tired. The kind that comes after surviving a storm and knowing the roof held, even if the neighborhood didn't. By then the HOA was no more. After the county hearing, a community-wide vote dissolved the organization entirely. A temporary stewardship committee had been formed. 5 residents, including Cynthia and Barbara, with oversight from a city planner assigned to help guide the transition. Ron Keller and Lacey Kim never returned after the hearing. As for Marcy, no one had heard a word. She'd gone dark, left her house abandoned. A for sale sign eventually appeared out front with a private number and no listing. Her name, once uttered in every heated conversation, was now a whisper, and soon it wouldn't be mentioned at all. I thought that would be the end. But the real ending came later, quiet, unexpected, and far more personal than any court filing or public hearing. It was a Sunday morning, late spring. The lake behind my house, more a large pond, really was glass still. Birds were skimming its surface. The land had begun to bloom again. I stood by the waterline in an old flannel shirt, coffee in hand, when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned to see my son, Satan David, stepping out of his car. He hadn't visited since Christmas. "Hey, Dad," he said. I blinked. "You came." He looked around, letting the stillness sink in. "Cynthia sent me a clip of you on the news, said I should be proud." I chuckled. "Well, hell, if I'd known that's what it would take to get you out here." He smiled and hugged me. We didn't say much that first hour. We sat by the lake, let the silence stretch between us, but eventually he spoke. "I didn't know how much this place meant to you," he said. "Not just the house, the land, the work." I nodded slowly. "It's the first thing in my life I didn't build for someone else. It was mine, and when they tried to take it, I remembered who I was." He looked at me for a long time, then said, "I've been thinking of leaving the city, starting over somewhere quieter, maybe building something with my hands instead of staring at spreadsheets." I didn't say anything, just handed him the extra mug I'd brought. "You're always welcome here," I said finally. "Just don't knock down my damn wall." He laughed. Later that week, I received word from the county. All charges against me dropped, HOA liability confirmed, and a ruling in our favor for civil damages. The payout would come in installments, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about restoration, and not just of land, but of trust. I used part of the settlement to help fund new slope Stabilization along the walking trail, this time with benches built from stone and weather-treated wood. I even added a plaque, small and discreet, at the base of the trail. In memory of the lesson, listen to the ones who build. They know what holds. The plaque wasn't for me, it was for all of us. Cynthia went on to help other communities organize against abusive HOAs. Barbara became something of a local hero, quietly guiding reform behind the scenes. Even Mr. Ellerby began teaching slope safety to kids at the local school, using pictures of the landslide as a visual aid. But more than that, the neighborhood changed. Without the HOA's iron grip, people began helping one another more. Driveways got shoveled together. Holiday lights came back, quirky, uneven, and glorious. Lawns didn't all look the same anymore, but you could feel the pride in each one. As for me, I started hiking again. My knees complained, but I didn't mind. Every morning I'd walk the ridge trail, look down at the slope we'd nearly lost, and remember that even the most fragile terrain can be saved with the right foundation. Sometimes neighbors would wave as I passed. Sometimes they'd stop and ask questions about their own yards, their soil, their gutters. I answered everyone, not because I wanted to lecture, but because finally they were asking. One evening, David brought over his daughter, my granddaughter, for the first time in months. She was 5 and had never seen a wild rabbit before. We watched together as one hopped through the rosemary I'd replanted just beyond the new retaining wall. "Is this your land, Grandpa?" she asked. I looked at the hill, the lake, the earth that had once trembled beneath my feet, and I smiled. "Yes," I said, "and now it's yours too." The sun dipped behind the ridge, the air was cool, and at last the ground was still.